This has been an incredible privilege of mine, and I cannot express to you the delight and the joy and the honor that has been mine of being with you these 4 days. It just goes by far too quickly. Thank you, Dr. Bailey, for your kind introduction and for your warm welcome. Thank you to the faculty, to the students for the many wonderful conversations we've had. It has been an absolute delight, and I will go back with a whole new appreciation for what God is doing at this place and a whole new sense of kinship with you, because I sense that from the bottom of my heart beats in sync with yours, and that is such a delight to be with people who love the Lord and who love His Word and take it seriously. Our theme this morning is the privilege of calling, the Mosaic paradigm for missions. I would be remiss if I would not devote at least one of these Griffith Thomas lectures to the theme of missions, not only because world evangelization is dear to my heart, or because the Old Testament is such a fundamentally missiological document, but especially because of the historical interest in this institution in missions. For almost 2 decades, George W. Peters, one of the great missiological statesmen of the past century, ministered on this campus, holding high the torch of missions, not only here, though, but around the world. It so happens that Professor Peters was my wife's uncle. I would like to present this lecture on the privilege of calling the Mosaic paradigm for missions in his honor. One of Professor Peters' signature positions within his biblical theology of missions was the contrast he saw between the missiological strategy in the Old Testament and the New Testament, respectively. Although one may recognize a universal agenda in both testaments, the differences in the strategies in which this agenda is pursued may be summed up in 2 contrasting phrases which you find in his book, Centripetal Universality and Centrifugal Universality. The 2 paradigms are illustrated on the sheet you have with you. In 1972, Peters wrote, "Centrifugal universality is in effect when a messenger of the gospel crosses frontiers and carries the good news to the people of no faith. Centripetal universality, often mistaken for particularism, operates like a magnetic force, drawing distant peoples to a central place, people, or person. The latter is the methodology of the Old Testament, with Israel and the temple as the center, designed to draw people to themselves and to the Lord." That is the diagram on the left. The diagram on the right represents the way I see the center of gravity in the New Testament. I have Israel in quotes here as a representative of the church, not in the sense of a supersessionist interpretation of Israel. I do think that there's a place for physical Israel yet in the future, and in that regard, I am one with you. I use, not with everybody, I am well aware. Some of us are naive enough to believe that God's promises to Abraham and the fathers are eternal. That's why I have Israel in quotes here. It is the church, as we have it in Galatians 6:16, the Israel of God. 30 years later, after having written this, what I read from Dr. Peters, 30 years later, we might argue that Peters has overstated the contrast between Old and New Testament strategies, but we can scarcely deny the centripetal features of the divine missiological strategy as it is developed in the Old Testament. The Lord rescued Israel from the bondage of slavery and drew them into a covenant relationship with Himself as a glorious trophy of grace, that the whole world might know that He alone is God and that He alone can meet their deepest needs if, like Caleb or Rahab or Ruth, they cast themselves on Him. Although our passage is never cited in Peter's biblical theology of missions, I would like this morning to examine this short text of only 4 verses buried away in the latter part of Deuteronomy that has potential for assisting us in developing a biblical theology of missions. That is, Deuteronomy 26, 16 to 19. We will notice below that this short paragraph is not an isolated text. We have taken it kind of out of context, but we need to remember the context. It is intimately linked to Moses' preceding exposition of the law as revealed at Sinai, but it is also linked directly to what follows, that is, the covenant blessings and curses dealt with in chapters 28. My own hypothesis is that originally chapter 28 was attached directly to the end of chapter 26. I don't have time to talk about that here, but it flows smoothly from 26 into 28. At the same time, I cannot help, at the same time as I recognize the link of this text to its literary environment, I cannot help but think that as Moses is making this statement, as he is uttering these words, in his ears he hears ringing the words he heard from the Lord himself 40 years ago at the top of the mountain when the Israelites first came to Sinai. This is what you shall say to the family of Jacob and declare to the descendants of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the descendants of Israel. And now when you read Deuteronomy 26, 16 to the end, you can hear the echoes. This day the Lord your God commands you to do these statutes and ordinances. You shall be therefore be careful to do them with all your heart and with all your soul. You have today heard the Lord declare himself to be your God, and that you should walk in his ways and keep his statutes and his commandments and his ordinances and listen to his voice. And the Lord has heard you today declare that you would be his people, a treasured possession, as he promised you, and that you should keep all his commandments, and that he will set you high above the nations which he has made, for praise and fame and honor, and that you should be a consecrated people to the Lord your God, as he has spoken. It is not difficult to see the links between these two texts, not only lexical links, but also thematic. In the Exodus 19, 3-6 text that I read first, you see the Lord's plan for missions in barest outline. First, it gives us the basis of Israel's calling. Second, the essence of Israel's calling. And third, the keys to the fulfillment of Israel's calling. I would like to look at our text this morning under these same headings. My outline is obviously expository rather than exegetical, inasmuch as it is driven by thematic logic rather than the flow of the text itself. And so I would like to begin then by looking at the basis of Israel's calling. According to Exodus 19:4-6, Israel's missionary calling is based upon the Lord's previous gracious acts on her behalf. In fine homiletical style. Aren't you amazed how the Lord tends to give things in threes for your sermons next Sunday morning? In fine homiletical style, the Lord had given Moses 3 divine actions for which the Israelites should be eternally grateful. He has solved the problem of the Egyptians. You see what I've done to them. He has carried them on eagle's wings, that is, caring for them throughout the history of this family, but especially during the last weeks and months. And thirdly, he has brought them to himself. In all this, we recognize an extremely important principle of missions. Those who are called to missionary service are the products of God's gracious, saving, and covenantal action. The last expression is especially important for our understanding, how I brought you to myself. Especially important for understanding of Israel's place in God's scheme of things. God did not call Israel basically to a code of conduct, but to a relationship with himself. Let's see how this is expressed in our text. Verses 17-19 divide into 2 parts, which are unequal in size, but otherwise display a remarkable parallelism, as you have it in the English translation on your sheet. The corresponding features are highlighted here by putting them alongside. In each instance, the opening declaration is particularly striking because these represent the only occurrences in the entire Old Testament of the Hiphil form of Amer, to say, to declare, which raises special problems of interpretation. In my notes, I have an explanation of why I go the way I do, and I will forego that for this morning. But according to my understanding, the Hiphil of Amer here is best interpreted in a quasi-juridical sense, according to which each party to an agreement hears the other party declare its commitment to the stipulations of the agreement. The mutuality of these declarations is remarkable, though not without precedent, either in the making of treaties or the establishment of personal covenantal relationships. The former is illustrated most dramatically by the treaty between Ramses II of Egypt and the Hittite king Hattusili III in the 13th century BC. This treaty has been preserved in two versions, one Egyptian and one Hittite. The former, the Egyptian, which represents a translation into Egyptian of the Akkadian original, was carved on the walls of the temple of Ammon and Karnak and the Ramesseum in Egypt, while the latter has been preserved on three fragmentary cuneiform tablets discovered in Bogazkoy in Turkey. The procedure underlying these two texts, two copies of the treaty, seem to have transpired something like this. First, diplomats representing both sides settled upon the terms of the agreement. Second, representatives of each side produced a version styled as the words of the respective monarchs. Third, these versions were inscribed in cuneiform in the Akkadian language, the language of international diplomacy, on tablets of precious metal, in this case silver. 4, these tablets were exchanged and then taken home. And 5th, the texts were translated into the native language, providing the Egyptians and Hittites, respectively, with constant reminders of the obligations to which the other party had bound himself. It's a rather extraordinary thing we observe there. This explains why the version produced by the Hittite chancellery has been preserved in Egypt. And the version produced by the Egyptians, they found in Bogazkoy. Our text seems to presuppose an oral version of this procedure, according to which Israel heard the Lord declare his commitment to them, probably through the mediation of Moses, and the Lord heard the people declare their commitment to him. Such declarations represent the means by which relations that do not exist naturally are created. Accordingly, in the present instance, when Israel hears the Lord declare orally his commitment to be their God, and when the Lord hears Israel declare orally that they will be his treasured people, the present generation standing before Moses is, shall we say, constituted, or is it reconstituted, the privileged people of the Lord. In 27:9, Deuteronomy, Moses and the Levitical priests formally declare the significance of the event. Silence! Hear, O Israel, this day you have been constituted the people of the Lord your God. This special covenant relationship provides the foundation for Israel's call to reach the nations with the gospel of God's grace. Which leads me to the second point, the nature or essence of the calling. Having observed how the present generation has confirmed their acceptance of the covenant relationship that God has promised Abraham and ratified with their parents at Sinai, we may now ask why this relationship has been created. To what has Israel been called? The answer can be highlighted by plotting the privileges and obligations to which Israel and the Lord respectively hear the other party obligate himself, as in the obverse side of your sheet, in the synopsis that I have there. What Israel has heard the Lord declare in verse 17 is much simpler stylistically and with respect to substance than what the Lord hears Israel declare in verses 18 to 19. But we want to look at these, first of all, with respect to the privileges that are assigned to Israel in this document. There are 4 privileges that God has assigned to Israel. First, Israel is called to be the people of the Lord. This privilege is declared from 2 sides. On the one hand, the Israelites have heard the Lord declare that He will be your God. I promise to be your God, verse 17. Although Moses expresses Israel's special relationship with the Lord more than 300 times in Deuteronomy with this expression, your God or our God, 300 times plus in the book, and the Lord has introduced Himself as the God of Israel in the preamble to the Decalogue, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Remarkably, the infinitive clause here, to be your God, is the first or the closest explicit reference to the covenant formula that we have yet encountered in 26 chapters, which is rather remarkable given that this is such a covenantal book. The bilateral nature of the Lord's covenant relationship with Israel will be expressed more fully in 29:12, where the goal of the covenant and the oath that Yahweh makes with His people is defined as follows: that He may establish you today as His people, and that He may be your God as He promised you, and as He swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The promise to the ancestors to which He here refers is recorded in Genesis 17:7. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your offspring after you. The present generation of Israelites hereby hears the Lord declare His fulfillment of that ancient promise. Now, whatever else it means to be a people belonging to the Lord, this should not be interpreted as a casual relationship. On the contrary, this is an intimate covenantal association, analogous to that which exists between a husband and a wife and a father and a son. Although the relationship between the Lord and Israel in Deuteronomy is often understood primarily as a covenant relationship between a divine suzerain and his human vassal, the Sitz im Leben of the covenant formula, don't you love that expression? The Sitz im Leben, the setting in life of the covenant formula to which the present declarations allude, may actually derive from the context of family law. It has long been recognized that the formula, I will be your God and you shall be my people, bears a striking resemblance to both the ancient Hebrew marriage formula, I will be your husband and you shall be my wife, and the adoption formula, I will be your father and you shall be my son. These forms of the formula appear to represent only the statement made during the marriage ceremony by the husband and the statement of the father in the adoption ceremony, respectively. But such contracts were mutual. Presumably, in a marriage ceremony, it would also involve the wife saying, I will be your wife and you shall be my husband. And in an adoption ceremony, if the child was old enough, the child would say, I will be your son or your daughter and you shall be my father. Support for this connection between adoption and being the people of the Lord may be found in chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, where you are the sons belonging to the Lord your God. That recalls the adoption. Is followed up with, you are the people belonging to the Lord your God, in the next sentence. Israel is the people of God. Second, Israel has been called to be the Lord's special treasure. While Israel welcomes the Lord's affirmation of Himself as their God, the Lord no doubt delights in hearing the Israelites declare, and now I'm moving to the right side of your chart, the Lord no doubt delights in hearing the Israelites accept the privileges that you have mentioned there. First of all, to be His treasured people. Segula is a rare word occurring only 8 times in the Old Testament. In 6 of these, it is used in the present metaphorical sense, but its concrete usage in the other 2 provides the key to its metaphorical significance. In 1 Chronicles 29:3 and Ecclesiastes 2:8, the word is used of valued possession, especially the treasure of kings. According to Deuteronomy 14:1, Israel is granted this status through the specific act of divine election. Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, the Lord has singled out Israel to be his diamond. How can I illustrate this? I grew up on the farm in northern Saskatchewan, and I don't know why the Lord cursed our family with giving us the kind of land that he did. Every spring before we put the crop in, we'd have to haul off the rocks. It was a burdensome and painful chore, and all you got for it was a pile of rocks and blisters and a sore back. But before you'd get the machinery out there, you had to do it, or you'd ruin your machinery. It would be fine if it had happened only once, but for some reason or other, next spring on that hill, it was full of rocks again. I was convinced that the devil spent the winter down below pushing up rocks so that in spring we'd have something to do again. Now, there's nothing enjoyable about hauling rocks, trust me. On the other hand, it's a waste of time, really. But if one day, while we were hauling rocks, we would have spotted in the distance a bright, shining light, and we go over it and we look at that little rock, and we think, oh, that's got to be quartz. But it's brighter than any quartz I've ever seen. So you take it to the local jeweler, and he says, where did you get that? And the answer is, out in the field we found it. Just a tiny little rock. But on the other hand, he says, this is not just a rock. This is a diamond. And you go home excited because this makes everything worth it all. Because it reflects the glory and the grace of the light that shines upon. This is what Israel is to God. God's special diamond. That they might reflect his glory and his grace to the world. Don't feel sorry for the Israelites. This is an awesome privilege. Third, Israel has been called to be a light of God's grace to the nations. We know of this expression from Isaiah. You don't find it in Deuteronomy, but Isaiah describes the mission of the servant of the Lord in these terms. The expression is not found in Deuteronomy, but the concept is certainly present in verse 19, which represents one of the most remarkable statements in all of Deuteronomy, for it declares in unequivocal terms the Lord's dreams for Israel. Despite her insignificant size, chapter 7, and her moral discredits, chapter 9, he has assigned her a status superior to all the nations he has made. For the most part, previous references in Deuteronomy to Israel's relationship to the nations have understood the nations narrowly as the groups occupying the land of Canaan, whose land they are about to take. But with this comment, his gaze is cast far beyond Cis and Transjordan to the world as a whole, to all the nations that the Lord has made. This interpretation is confirmed in 28 verse 1, which, as I intimated before, may well have followed immediately after at one point. In terms that obviously echo this statement, Moses reiterates that if Israel will conscientiously listen to the voice of the Lord their God and scrupulously keep all his commands by doing them, then the Lord will set them high above all the nations of the earth. Now, our text does not specify how Israel's superiority over the nations will be expressed. Moses has provided hints of what he has in mind, for instance, in chapter 59, where he says, you shall lend to many and not borrow. You shall rule over many nations, but they shall not rule over you. That speaks of economic and political hegemony. This sense is reinforced in chapter 28, 2-14, the covenant blessings, where Moses describes in detail the blessings that will accrue to Israel if they are faithful to the Lord. Now, although verse 19 does not describe how Israel will be elevated above the nations, in 19a beta, Moses summarizes the effects for praise and fame and honor. Now, the dictionary meanings of these words are clear. However, scholars and translations disagree on how praise, fame, and honor are to be understood in this context. In accordance with the emphasis on Israel's privileges in verses 18 to 19, NIV's rendering suggests the honor is Israel's. To be set high above the nations for praise, fame, and honor describes a fate for Israel that is the opposite of that envisioned in 9:14, where the Lord threatens to destroy Israel and blot out her name from under the heaven. However, this interpretation is not as secure as is reflected in some of these translations, and the text is actually quite ambiguous. So some translations leave it, and he will set you high above all nations that he has made in praise, in fame, and in honor, without specifying whose. It's probably the most honest approach. And then others, like the Revised English Bible, which interpret the text to bring him praise and fame and glory. And I think there are at least 3 good reasons for doing this, which I shall forego in my oral presentation. But let me just give the final consideration in my conviction that this is the right interpretation by referring you to Jeremiah 33:9. And this city shall be to me a name of joy, a praise, and a glory before all the nations of the earth, who shall hear of all the good that I do for them. They shall fear and tremble because of all the good and all the prosperity I have provided them. This is to the praise and glory of his name. Fourth, Israel has been called to be a holy people. This interpretation of praise, fame, and honor is reinforced by the 4th privilege noted by Moses in this context. The Lord hereby declares their status not simply as a people or his people, but a holy people, a set-apart people. And then the text adds, as he has promised, which forces us again to go back and ask, where was that promise? I am convinced again that search leads ultimately to Exodus 19:5-6, the verses that I read at the beginning. This total statement has profound significance for our understanding of Israel's missionary role. The Lord did not separate Israel from the nations merely that he might lavish his attention on her as if she were a pet Siamese kitten or a Chihuahua puppy or a lawn ornament out there that he could admire. Just as the Levites were set apart to serve as the Lord's agents of grace, mediating between him and Israel, so Israel collectively was to serve as the link between God and the world. The need for mediation is created by the estrangement of the world from its Creator. Accordingly, as the Lord's chosen priestly order, Israel was to declare the light of his revelation to the nations and intercede on her behalf before him. Now, on first sight, the analogy of the Levites seems to support a centripetal understanding of Israel's mission. But it isn't that cut and dried. This understanding must be qualified. In Israel, priestly service was not rendered only at the temple. On the contrary, the Levites were scattered throughout the nation in their assigned cities, presumably to represent the Lord where the people lived and to receive their entreaties there. When we reflect on the place of Israel in God's soteriological plan, we should not feel sorry for them. Their status as the covenant people of God, his special treasure, his light to the nations and his holy people, represented an unprecedented, otherwise unimaginable privilege. That they failed in their mission says nothing about the plan. It speaks only of the persistent problem of rebellion and unbelief that affects the human race as a whole, often including those who are called to represent God in the missionary enterprise. And it could be even us. Thirdly, we move quickly to the burden of Israel's calling. If God's call to Israel to salvation was absolutely unconditional, and it was, that is, the call to salvation, unconditional, the Lord himself declared unequivocally in Exodus 19:4-6 that the nation's effectiveness in fulfilling her call to mission was conditional. If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The success of Israel's mission, her being a light to the nations, depended upon her listening to the voice of the Lord and keeping his covenant. This is the consistent witness of Deuteronomy as well, including our text, which stresses the importance of fidelity to the covenant in no uncertain terms. As already noted, although there's a remarkable bilaterality and mutuality to the affirmations to which Israel and the Lord commit themselves here, this is no parity treaty. On the contrary, following the Lord's declaration that he would be Israel's God, the Israelites hear him remind them of their obligations to him. These obligations are summarized in 3 typically Deuteronomic phrases. You must walk in his ways, you must keep all his commandments, and you must listen to his voice. In the present context, the reference then is primarily to the commands that issue from Yahweh's mouth. It is primarily to the commands that come from his mouth. We shouldn't limit it, this listening to his voice, to commands and laws. If the glorious word of the gospel with which the Decalogue opens is not enough, we need only to recall Moses' quasi-catechetical presentation of the significance of the laws in 6:20-25, as we discussed on Tuesday. Unless Israel remembers the grace of the Lord in her salvation, the demands of covenant will become burdensome and seem repressive. In the light of Deuteronomy 4:28, the fact that Israel serves a God who speaks at all, you shall listen to his voice. Imagine, God speaks. Remember the prayer we read on Tuesday about these gods that do not speak. Let me bring this to a conclusion with some reflections. With Moses' final declaration of Israel's holiness in accordance with the word of the Lord, he concludes his exposition on the stipulations of the covenant, chapters 12-26. All that remains for him is to address, in this address, is to lay out in detail the consequences for Israel of her response to the challenge and the privilege of being in special covenant relationship with the Lord, which he will do in chapter 28. The manner in which Moses concludes this section has profound implications, not only for a biblical theology of law, but also for a biblical understanding of Israel's role in the divine program of revelation and redemption. Israel's missionary function does not receive a great deal of space or attention in the record of the Sinai revelation. I'm sure you're well aware of that. But this does not mean that it is lacking. On the contrary, it is front-loaded. The Lord had set the context and parameters for his covenant at the very beginning when he promised Israel that if they would keep his covenant and listen to his voice, they would be his treasured possession, his kingdom of priests, and his holy nation. With the addition of, for all the earth is mine, Exodus 19:5, the universal concern of the Lord implicit in the descriptors of Israel is rendered explicit. And it is only from this perspective that Israel's law can be understood. God did not reveal his law to his people merely to create a peculiar people, in the modern sense of the term, but to declare to the world what his glory and grace can accomplish in the lives of those who are destitute and enslaved. Having declared his fundamental purpose at the outset, there was no need for him during the rest of the Sinai revelation to keep reiterating his universalist goals as he had at the beginning. If Deuteronomy places a slightly greater emphasis on Israel's place among the nations than the Sinai revelation itself, which it does, the perspective here is rooted firmly in Exodus 19:5-6. Perhaps most significantly, the nations are presented as the context from which the Lord chose Israel and in the eyes of which he established them as his treasured people with a goal of setting them above all the nations. To achieve this goal, the Lord would grant to Israel the extraordinary prosperity and economic and political hegemony. However, as God himself had expressed so forcefully in Exodus 19, the status and role would be contingent on fidelity to him, demonstrated in obedience to his covenant stipulations. If we fail to recognize the connection between the grace of God and salvation and the mission of God in obedience and representation, we will distort the law either on the side of antinomianism or on the side of legalism. The Israelites would fulfill their role as the descendants of Abraham through whom God intended to bless the whole world only as they would walk in the ways of the Lord and listen to his voice. Neither the ancestor nor his descendants were chosen for their own sakes. When the Lord called Abraham to covenant relationship with himself, and when he confirmed this covenant with Israel at Sinai and again on the plains of Moab, he had the nations in view. As noted by Professor Peters and others, the paradigm for missions makes a significant shift when we move from the Old Testament to the New. In Deuteronomy, the pattern is fundamentally centripetal. While the world watches, the Lord delivers Israel from her bondage to the Egyptian. The world watches him enter into covenant relationship with her. The world watches as he hands the land of Canaan into her hands, and the world watches as he blesses her. As his covenant partner, his special treasure, his holy people, Israel becomes a parade example of the power of divine grace and glory to the praise and renown and honor of the Lord. What the Lord had done for Israel, he seeks to do for all. But like Caleb and Rahab and Ruth, they must come to Israel. Neither in Deuteronomy nor anywhere else in the Torah do we read of a missionary mandate anything like the Great Commission in Matthew 28, by which Israelites were commanded to go to the nations and proclaim Yahweh to them. It should have happened more naturally. The prevailing formula was simple: demonstrate gratitude for divine grace through loyal living and experience the blessing of the Lord, thereby attracting the attention of the nations who would give praise and glory to the Lord and join Israel in their covenant relationship with him. And here I think the Queen of Sheba in 1 Kings 10 is an illustration. In the face of Israel's failure and exile, the missional strategy presented in the New Testament appears to change. However, to conclude that a centrifugal approach displaces centripetal strategy is too simplistic. Peter seems to assume that the New Testament believers had inherited the role of Israel when he applies to Exodus 19 to Christians. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his treasured people, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles, abstain from passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good works and glorify God on the day of your visitation. Now, there's no hint in this context that when he speaks to these Christians, he is talking to them as people who had been consciously sent out as missionaries. Rather, like ancient Israel among the Gentiles, these are Christians who find themselves in pagan communities. By their inclusion in the covenant community, their experience of the grace of God and their godly conduct, through their godly conduct, they were to proclaim the excellencies of God who had called them out of darkness into his light. And I think Jesus assumes the continuation of the old paradigm when he declares in Matthew 5:13, you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world, and the city that's set on a hill will not be hid. However, at the end of the gospel, Jesus himself shifts the center of strategic gravity from come and see what God has done to go tell the world what God has done. Thereafter, not only do we find the covenant community itself defined in ever-expanding concentric circles that extend far beyond ethnic and territorial Israel, but specific persons like Paul are called to carry the gospel of divine grace to the Gentiles, establishing in every place microcosms of the covenant community universal. Indeed, the scriptures close with a glorious vision of people from every tribe and nation redeemed, and guess what? Centripetally drawn to the Lamb to worship. Revelation 5:9 and 7:4. As I close, my prayer is that the Lord would give us grace to fulfill both his centripetal and his centrifugal calling. May we be faithful in proclaiming the excellencies of him who has called us out of darkness into his marvelous light in the neighborhoods where he has placed us, and may we heed his call to go to the ends of the earth, that all the earth may know that the Lord, incarnate in Jesus Christ, is God and Lord of all, to the praise of his glory and the magnificent extension of his grace. We ask in his name. Amen.